All right, g'day everyone. We haven't actually talked heaps about this before coming, but we've just had the pleasure of meeting Christian Stevens, who's going to be one of the speakers at our conference, and I actually listened to your podcast with Francis Tanner, which is pretty good. It was like 3 hours. I didn't actually finish it, but I was like, all right, yeah, this guy's good. So yeah, pretty much we just want to, I guess, get to know you a bit more. Obviously, you're doing your doctorate now, and I guess you know what you're going to bring to the table here for the conference as well.
Yeah. What I'm going to bring?
Oh, yeah. So I guess, tell us about yourself. So you're
Yeah.
lecturing at Notre Dame and you've
Yeah,
got a
I'm
family
lecturing at
too.
Notre Dame, that's right. So I've been there for 12 and a half years now, which feels like a long time. You know, I remember when I started getting my long service leave, like I could take long service leave, I thought, oh my gosh, I've been here a while, you know. So I've been there for that long, married, got 5 beautiful kids. And that's a lot of what I'm doing now. Yeah.
So were you married before you started lecturing at Notre Dame,
It
or?
all kind of lined up, you know. So it was one of those things where it really marked a chapter in my life because I started this job right around the same time as I met my wife, and so it's kind of all lined up. And then we got married, I think, when I was in my second year at work, and then my first child came around in the year after, and so it's all kind of happening.
Oh, it's beautiful. And just for the people so they get a bit of understanding, what do you lecture in at Notre Dame?
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm teaching in moral theology, in Christian spirituality, and in our core curriculum, which is an introduction to philosophy and theology.
Yeah, beautiful. And what drew you to lecturing in those? You know, was that a personal interest, or you just kind of stumbled upon lecturing those classes? Or what is it there for you?
Yeah. So it's a good question. There's a couple of things to it. So I think I can't remember a time where I kind of thought to myself, I want to be a university lecturer, that's what I'm going to set out to do. I think through a series of events in my life, I fell in love with the topics, you know. I just got this desire to learn and this hunger to read. And I can remember coming to the end of my undergraduate degree, which was in exercise science, and being pretty sure this isn't what I wanted to do, but I had no idea what else to do, you know. And I was in the car with my auntie, she lives in Queensland, and she said to me, you know, one of the things I love about my husband? I said, what? She goes, when he wakes up in the morning, he doesn't know if what he's doing is for business or pleasure. Like, he'd be doing it anyway, even if he wasn't getting paid. And in my mind, I'm like, that's what I want. Like, that's the dream, you know? And so it's like, well, what do I love doing? And I loved reading philosophy and theology. I love talking to people about this. And so it kind of like just went from there, as in, well, what then are the jobs you could have that could do this kind of thing? But for me, the first kind of port of call was actually discerning to going to the seminary. So I was at Good Shepherd Seminary in 2009. When I discerned out of that, I was still kind of on this trajectory of how I was going to be discerning what I do.
So how long were you in the seminary for?
Just 1 year.
Just 1 year.
Yeah.
And just, I suppose, something prior to that is, you know, what is your family background? You know, what drove you as a young man? Obviously, like we get to see this guy who's now a lecturer at Notre Dame, and we're sort of slowly unpacking that. But how did that start for you, that journey of faith?
Yeah. So I come from a Catholic family, so I'm a cradle Catholic in that sense. But there was definitely a period of kind of having that contained or isolated in my mind and it not actually being lived out and followed through. You know, it was kind of like a present but in a sterilized way, you know. And so I think my experience was that of a lot of cradle Catholics. There's a sense of you go through some stages and there's a kind of period of waking up to then realize that in your desire for the truth about things, all of a sudden you realize you've had a treasure here this whole time that you just did not appreciate, you know. there's a saying, familiarity breeds contempt. I don't know if you guys have heard of that.
Yeah.
So there's a particular challenge that a cradle Catholic has because of their familiarity with Catholicism that can make you indifferent and lukewarm to it in a way that, like, say, the great converts aren't, because they have this sense of the newness of it. You know, so I went through a period like that of coming to recognize this as really true, not merely part of a family heritage. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's that realization as well that it doesn't just affect 1 hour on a Sunday. It actually
It
affects
can't.
yeah,
Yeah, it
every
can't.
waking
It
hour.
can't. It's funny when you're trying to raise kids and you try and articulate these things. You're forced to think about it. You know, it's amazing.
Yeah.
The questions kids can put on you when they're 5 or 6
Yeah.
is amazing. Anyway, so one of my daughters might be like, I don't want to go to mass, you know, and then someone might say, oh, well, God, look at all the things God's given you. He's only asking for 1 hour. And there's a sense in which that makes sense, but he's not. He's asking for the lot. You know what I mean? If you think giving him the 1 hour is going to make sense, you're kind of entering into a kind of contractual arrangement with God
Yeah.
that's more like how the pagans related to their own deities of they only just want you to rock up at a certain place, perform the externals, and then you can leave, and that's all you had to do.
Yeah. No, we were just talking about that today actually in our theology tutorial. I guess one question before we go forwards as well. I'm always curious as to like, because your, I guess, point of view as a lecturer, but did you ever struggle with the question of like, oh, studying this stuff is a waste of time, or it doesn't affect so much the material world, like, or that tension between, oh, like, I need to start making money, I need to work, I need to build that career.
100%, yeah, 100%.
So how'd you
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
deal with that?
I think you deal with it by realizing that the goods that you're dedicated to, the spiritual and intellectual goods you're dedicated to, are destined to be signs of contradiction in this world. And so there's a sense in which it's very tempting to look at your friends and see what they're doing, the money they're making, and whatever, you know, worldly measure of success is. And you've just got to realize that if God's calling you to serve Him in this way, that's essentially a temptation. And it's hard because there's a sense in which you can be quite idealistic early on in thinking the impact you might have or whatnot. But then as you get older, you realize that you've entered into essentially a spiritual battle that's been going on for millennia, and you're doing your part. And it might not seem huge. You might not have any enormous metrics of success, but that's the service that you're offering to God here and now, you know. And so if you can just help the students in front of you, if you can help them to see something they wouldn't have seen, then that's the fruit. That's the tremendous worthiness of it.
Dang, it's an insane answer. Yeah, well, I guess onto the topic of your talk. So the title, I can't remember the whole list, but it was a whole bunch of, what would you call them, different archetypes
yeah,
or
yeah.
whatever.
The Rainbow Club.
The rainbow.
Yeah. So I tell you how I got that list. I went to ChatGPT and I said,
Okay.
what are the most used terms for different kinds of masculinity on the internet? You know, and so it just started pumping out all of these kinds, and then, you know, and
Yeah.
then some I knew, and then some I was like, what is that? And I had to kind of look it up and find out what that was. But yeah, so that's how that kind of came to be.
Yeah, I already had a bunch of people mention that, oh, this looks like a good one. But as your subtitle was finding or restoring unity. Oops.
Or sanity, I
Yeah,
think.
sanity and
Yeah.
male identity politics.
Yeah.
So I guess could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah. Well, I can't give the whole thing away.
Of course,
I
of
can't give the whole
course.
thing
Yeah,
away.
yeah.
But basically, what I'm gonna suggest is that there is a single line in Genesis 2 that can lay a foundation that we can start building on, and it's the verse which comes after Adam recognizing his wife, and then it says something like, and therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. And so what I'm going to suggest is that it's one of those rare moments where basically there's something particularly pinned down to the relationship between the masculine and the feminine that is going to allow for us to kind of ground a common identity amidst all the various preferences that people might have and customary ways of doing things. There's something here that we can strive for as a matter of principle.
And is this something that's come to you anecdotally, or is this something, you've just sort of, like, have you lived it, you've seen it, or is this something, through your research, doing your doctorate and all that kind of stuff?
It's always all the above. Yeah. There's a sense in which the great trap of, I think, any intellectual is to spend so much time looking in the book that you forget your experience. It's like the mark of the ideologue, right? They just have lost touch with their own immediate experience with reality and now simply talk in jargon that just doesn't correlate to anything, So it's definitely been part experience, but then also partly my involvement in, say, particularly philosophical anthropology and theological anthropology. You realize that that is often a ground where we either get things right or we get them dramatically wrong. So yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess just before we wrap up, you're not a small man. You've obviously hit the weights before, so I guess could you tell us your numbers and then also a bit why it's important to be going to the gym?
My numbers.
Yeah.
Oh man, I don't know. It's crazy, I think I was at my strongest when I was about 18 years old. I think it was all downhill from there. There's something about...
He's only 21. We'll just clarify that.
So there's something about that age where you really respond well, and I think your joint health is kind of at its peak. So I think in terms of my lifting numbers, I've probably got to go back that far, I think once I benched 140 for 3 or 4 reps. But yeah, like I said, it's not long after that. I reckon if I tried to do that, I would have blown something out, But yeah, I try to just keep moving. Part of the reason why it's so important is I think the stakes are so much higher now for us than it's ever been, that if you're not setting aside time to physically move, you just won't. Your work and your entertainment won't require you to move that much. And then I remember being really impacted by something that Tony Robbins said. You guys know Tony Robbins? Yeah. He's got this big thing about the relationship between emotion and motion. And he always says that motion precedes emotion. So it's kind of like if you're not physically moving, you kind of start to feel less alive.
I definitely noticed that with, it might be like at work, like you feel a bit sick in the morning.
Yeah.
Whether you decide to get up and to go to work or whether you just like stay in bed determines how you emotionally feel far more than you could ever imagine.
Yeah, everything's integrated. So same as diet, right? So I got to give a talk at this men's conference on Saturday, and they've given me gluttony to talk about, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few weeks. But it's amazing that what we choose to eat and how we eat affects how we feel, which then affects our approach to our responsibilities and what we take on and don't take on. And so it's kind of like it's all integrated. And once you realize that, then you start to realize that decisions you're making in one area of your life can really be affecting others.
Yeah, I think me and Tomas are doing an interesting program at the moment with the Catholic Psych Institute with Dr. Greg Bottaro, and a big part of the whole process. And we're going to have another speaker called Sean. He's also runs Catholic Psych here in Australia. But a big part of what they discuss is the Catholic anthropology, how we're both body and soul, and how they need to be connected, and that we can't forget that connection between the two.
Exactly.
So it's so important. And when we do disconnect one, then we have a lack of harmony in the person, and it has an incredible effect on our whole being, both and like mentally, spiritually, in a way that we couldn't really imagine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was reading during the week Saint Ignatius of Loyola's autobiography, and you're just struck by, on this topic, his awareness of how he needs to be physically disciplining himself to stay spiritually sharp. So the more he experienced comforts in one area of his life, the more he ramped up his discipline somewhere else to keep the eye of the tiger, so to speak. But if he got flabby in terms of physical comforts, he realized there was gonna be a spiritual correlation to that in his battle for temperance and zeal for the faith and things like that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned temperance, because we've obviously got the cardinal virtues, and in some ways they're very natural virtues. Like they're
That's
not
right,
supernatural. They don't require the faith. It's just, fortitude, temperance, and those things are kind of precursors to all the other good stuff. Like if you want to build that strong spiritual life, that strong prayer life, well, you're gonna have to be able to get up in the morning and actually do it.
Yeah.
So I love how that kind of works. You've just got that step by step.
Yeah, that's right. And you're right. In principle, the natural virtues can be acquired without the faith. But I would say in the order of reality, in virtue of our fallen condition, it's often some form of at least implicit faith that wakes people up to try and at least do these things well. Say for example, if someone's just caught in the grip of like a soft nihilism and just thinks, well, what's the point? All I've got in my life are these cheap pleasures at night or whatever. The motivation to battle for temperance is just not there, because that is actually helping them. It's a self-soothing process, So paradoxically, it's often when people have some experience of grace that they actually start to realize, I need to take better care of myself. Even though I'm not interested in it for my own sake, I owe it to God, I owe it to my neighbor, and I owe it to myself to do that.
And I think just kind of building on that point is the very psychological truth of that. When we have this hope in Christ and we have a trust in salvation and resurrection, we can really get out of our doing mind. We can get out of that part of us. We can be present in that moment, which helps us to get out of that despair. I often I like that talk about, how like things like pornography or masturbation for men, while they have a really negative consequence in a man's life, the Lord can relieve someone of that temptation, that moment. But really, the worst is when men despair and when they lose.
right,
That nihilism
exactly
is so
right.
much worse.
Exactly
So it's
right.
like, for men, it's really like keeping the courage there, like just keep going.
Exactly right.
And you slowly build these virtues, but it's really a beautiful way.
Exactly right. There's a sense in which, like, if you think of as an analogy in boxing, it does matter how many times you got knocked down, but if you got up, if you keep getting back up, it entirely relativizes that. It's really the not getting back up that marks the final defeat. So when Jesus talks about the unforgivable sin, and you read the commentators on this, they talk about the sin of despair. And the reason why it's unforgivable is not that it's so heinous in itself that it's greater than God's mercy, but it's because the nature of this kind of sin is you don't seek out God's mercy. You think that whatever this is, it's bigger than Him.
Yeah, I think that point kind of relates pretty well to your talk, and in the sense of the rainbow community, because a lot of these people, unfortunately, like all these different things becomes their identity rather than their identity be rooted in God. And so then when someone attacks that or says or someone challenges them on their belief in this area, that area of their life becomes their whole person, and so they do despair, and they have a lack of like this is who I am. You know, I can't be anyone
Yeah,
else.
that's
So how
right.
am I supposed to be that person? You know, like how am I
Yeah,
this child
yeah,
of God
yeah.
if you take this part of me away?
Yeah, that's right. Which kind of like is it's an admittance to a certain kind of slavery insofar as I don't have a choice about what I do or what attitude I take to this, you know. Whereas, of course, in virtue of being rational and free creatures, sure, there's a lot about you that you don't sit back and get to decide from scratch. You know, you kind of
Yeah.
find yourself with it. But you always retain the freedom to take a particular attitude towards that. And that's what you're judged on. That's where the quality of your character is determined by, not the things you spontaneously find yourself with, but what was within your control. And when we blur these things together, that's how we kind of oscillate between this pride and victim mentality, you know. And you can kind of see it in these ideological movements where it's not clear what exactly you're saying is up to the person's choice versus what isn't their choice. You know, there's sometimes you hear that it's up to them, it's whatever you choose, but then sometimes we hear no, it's about deep-seated, spontaneous emotions that you can't decide against. You know, so it oscillates between these two, and so there's an oscillation between I'm a victim of my constitution or circumstances, or no, I'm not a victim and I'm totally proud of this and this is excellent. And so it kind of can't get its story straight intrinsically. But if you just realize that in virtue of us all being fallen, we all have identity disorders, we all have sexual disorders, and so there's not anything particularly unique about that. But like you kind of said, it's about rediscovering our identity as, in nature, creatures made in the image of God, and then in grace, called to be in Christ and be glorified with Him. Wherever your starting place is, whatever you're struggling with, it's utterly relativized by those two things, nature and grace.
Yeah, no, it sort of really takes us back to Genesis, doesn't it? Like
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
talking
that's
about,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's a good spot to end it. Obviously, we're going to be obviously the conference is coming up, and so Christian Stevens is going to be there. He's left a lot hidden in his talk, and there's going to be a lot more to come. So if you've enjoyed this, look at some of his stuff the other stuff that he does. There's a lot of banger content out there. So yeah,
We'll get him back in the studio as well if you want. We're happy to get him back in the studio as well for round
Pleasure,
2.
mate.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks so much for making the time, Christian. It was a pleasure to meet you.
You too,
And
Tomas, Bede. Nice to meet you guys.
yeah, looking forward to hearing from you this Saturday as well at Be Not Afraid. Yeah.
Will do.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Christian. God bless.